Under the harsh Texas sun, traffic on Highway 83 slowed to a crawl, but not because of an accident. No, something much smaller and far wilder had stopped everyone in their tracks. A tiny bobcat kitten, desperate yet determined, stood in the middle of the road, refusing to move. Officer Sarah Winters had responded to her fair share of unusual calls, but this one was unlike any she'd encountered before. As she approached the trembling creature, she realized it wasn't simply lost or hurt, it was trying to communicate. And when her eyes caught the glint of metal on its leg, something clicked. Beyond the horizon, a mystery waited to be solved. What was this wild bobcat trying to show them? And why did it seem so intent on leading them somewhere? What had started as a simple patrol would soon unravel a life or death mystery no one could have anticipated. Before we dive in, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tap the notification bell to stay updated on all our latest stories. The summer heat bore down on Highway 83, stretching over the West Texas landscape like a shimmering mirage. The asphalt, glowing in the sun, seemed to stretch on forever, the traffic steady as it moved north toward Abilene and south toward San Angelo. Most drivers, unaware of the drama playing out on the shoulder, carried on with their journey. Officer Sarah Winters, squinting against the glare, adjusted her Stetson and glanced at the dispatch notes on her cruiser screen. At 34, with 11 years on the job with the Texas Department of Public Safety, she'd seen it all, but wildlife calls rarely made her stop in her tracks. Yet this one felt different. A small, aggressive animal disrupting traffic wasn't the usual call she'd prioritize. Dispatch, Unit 247, responding to wildlife incident at Highway 83, mile marker 143. ETA, 3 minutes, she reported, easing off the accelerator as she neared the scene. Roger that, Officer Winters. Be advised, additional calls have come in, motorists reporting what appears to be a juvenile bobcat behaving strangely. Sarah's interest peaked. In her experience, wild animals didn't run toward highways, they ran away from them. Something was off. She spotted the commotion before reaching the mile marker. A cluster of cars pulled over to the shoulder, drivers standing outside, phones in hand, snapping pictures. With calm precision, Sarah pulled her cruiser behind the last car, lights flashing to warn oncoming traffic. Stepping out into the oppressive heat, she adjusted her utility belt and approached a man wearing a faded Dallas Cowboys t-shirt, who appeared to be directing others to stay back. Afternoon, sir. Officer Sarah Winters, DPS. What's going on here? The man wiped sweat from his forehead. Mom, there's a baby bobcat over there, he said, pointing toward the median. Been trying to cross for about 20 minutes now. It runs out, then backs off, almost caused a pileup when a semi braked hard to avoid it. Sarah nodded, her gaze scanning the area. Has anyone tried to approach it? No, Mom. It's a wild animal, after all. But, he hesitated, then added, it seems distressed, almost like it's trying to get our attention. Never seen anything like it. She thanked the man and made her way toward the median, her hand instinctively resting on her holster. She had dealt with injured wildlife before, and even a young predator could be unpredictable. Then she saw it, a small bobcat kitten, no older than a few months. It spotted for Dusty from the roadside. It paced nervously along the edge of the median, darting toward the road before retreating when a vehicle approached. Sarah stayed back, observing. There was something strange in its behavior. This wasn't an animal simply crossing a road. It seemed to have purpose, frantic purpose. Raising her binoculars for a better look, she saw it, a small device strapped to the kitten's hind leg, marked with what looked like a blue symbol. This bobcat wasn't entirely wild. Sarah returned to her cruiser and made a call to the Regional Fish and Wildlife Office. Within 20 minutes, a white pickup truck with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department logo pulled up behind her cruiser. Dr. Stephen Mitchell, the regional wildlife biologist, stepped out, a weary man in his 50s, with sun-weathered skin and sharp eyes that took in everything. He'd spent over 2 decades working in wildlife. If anyone knew what was going on here, it was him. Dr. Mitchell, Sarah greeted, extending her hand. Thanks for coming out so quickly. Call me Stephen, he replied, shaking her hand firmly. Dispatch mentioned a tagged bobcat. That's enough to get my attention. Sarah quickly briefed him as they walked toward the median, making sure to keep their movements slow and non-threatening. There, she pointed. See the device on its leg? Stephen raised his binoculars, adjusting the focus. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. That's not one of ours. What do you mean? Wildlife Services uses specific collars, usually around the neck. This is something else, he continued observing. And there's a blue marker attached to it. Almost looks like, he trailed off, his brow furrowing. The bobcat noticed them and, rather than running off, it took a few tentative steps closer, stopping about 30 feet from them. It let out a soft, urgent sound, then began moving toward the forest on the other side of the highway, looking back to see if they were following. "It wants us to follow it," Stephen said, creeping into his voice. "Like Lassie," Sarah said, a bit skeptically. "I know how it sounds," Stephen replied, "but in 25 years of working with wildlife, I've never seen anything like this. Wild bobcats don't act like this." He squinted at the blue marker. "That tag, can I borrow your binoculars? Mine aren't as powerful." Sarah handed them over. Stephen studied the device closely. "There's a number on it, or W7734. His face went pale. "Sarah, that's not a wildlife tag. That's an emergency location marker, usually given to hikers in certain parks." "Why would a bobcat have a hiker's location marker?" "Good question. Let me make a call." Stephen retreated to his truck. When he returned 5 minutes later, his expression was grim. "I just spoke with the ranger station at Fortress Ridge State Park," Stephen said, his voice tight with concern. "They've had a missing hiker since yesterday, Robert Whitley, 42, an experienced outdoorsman. He checked in for a 3-day solo hike, but missed his scheduled check-in last night." Sarah's instincts kicked into high gear. "And the marker number matches," Stephen confirmed. "RW are his initials, and 7734 was his campsite registration." They both looked at the bobcat, still waiting, occasionally making that same urgent sound, its tiny body trembling with anticipation. "This doesn't add up," Sarah muttered. "How would a bobcat end up with a hiker's marker?" Stephen's brow furrowed in thought. "There might be a reason. Let me check something." He pulled out his tablet and scrolled through several screens. "Here," he said, pointing. "Ranger records show that Robert Whitley is a wildlife rehabilitator from Austin, specializes in big cats." Sarah's eyes widened as the pieces started falling into place. "So this could be his rescue."
Maybe he could have been tracking it as part of a rehabilitation program. But if that's the case, why is the bobcat here and Robert isn't? The implication hung in the air like an unanswered question. The bobcat made another, more insistent sound and took several more steps toward the forest. A sense of urgency settled over Sarah. "I'm going to follow it. If there's any chance it knows where this hiker is, I'm coming with you." Stephen cut in. "If Robert's injured, we might need medical supplies." Without hesitation, Stephen hurried to his truck, returning a moment later with a backpack, packed with basic first aid, water, and emergency rations. Standard search and rescue kit. Sarah radioed dispatch to update them on the situation and request backup. "We've got a potential missing persons case connected to the wildlife incident. Mitchell and I are going to investigate, requesting additional units and search and rescue on standby." "Copy that, Officer Winters. Be advised, nearest backup is 30 minutes out. Search and rescue has been notified but will stage until you confirm." "Understood. We'll proceed with caution and maintain radio contact." The bobcat, seeming to sense their decision, turned and trotted toward the tree line, checking back periodically to ensure they were following. "Never thought I'd be following a bobcat into the woods," Sarah muttered, crossing the highway and directing bystanders to clear the area. "Nature has a way of surprising us," Stephen replied, "especially when humans get involved." As they entered the forest, the temperature dropped noticeably under the canopy of oak and juniper trees. The bobcat stayed about 50 feet ahead, visible enough to follow, but maintaining a cautious distance. "It's staying on a clear path," Stephen observed. "That's another sign this isn't typical behavior. Wild bobcats, even partially rehabilitated ones, tend to stick to cover." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the ground for clues. "There," she pointed. "Boot prints, recent ones." Stephen knelt to examine them, nodding. "Good eye. These are fresh, maybe a day old. Men's hiking boots, probably size 11 or 12. They pressed on, following the bobcat through the forest. About a mile in, they came across a clearing where the undergrowth had been disturbed. Broken branches, flattened grass, and scattered personal items. A water bottle, a torn backpack strap, and most concerning of all, spots of what appeared to be dried blood on several leaves. "Someone passed through here in a hurry," Sarah said, her hand instinctively moving to her sidearm. "Or fell," Stephen added, pointing toward a steep drop-off at the edge of the clearing that hadn't been immediately visible. The bobcat stopped just before the drop-off, pacing anxiously and letting out that same urgent sound. It approached the edge, looked back at them, then turned its attention back to the ravine below. Sarah and Stephen exchanged a quick glance before making their way carefully to the edge. Below, about 30 feet down, was a ravine, its floor lined with a small stream. A fallen tree lay across the ravine, partially concealing a human form. "Robert!" Stephen called out. "Robert Whitley!" The figure stirred slightly, raising an arm in what might have been a weak wave. "He's alive," Sarah said with relief, then immediately radioed in. "Dispatch, we've located the missing hiker, ravine, approximately 1 mile east of Highway 83, at mile marker 143. Subject is alive but injured, requesting immediate medical evacuation. Copy that, Officer Winters. Search and rescue is mobilizing. ETA, 45 minutes to your location." Sarah took a quick mental inventory of the situation. "It's not too steep. We can make it down there." "I'll go first," Stephen offered. "I've got the medical supplies." They began making their way down the slope, carefully using trees and rocks for support. To their surprise, the bobcat found its own path down, moving with the natural agility of its species. When they reached the bottom, they found Robert Whitley conscious but clearly in pain. His leg was pinned under the fallen tree, and his face was pale from dehydration and exposure. But when he saw the bobcat approach, a weak smile tugged at his lips. "Nova," he whispered hoarsely. "Good girl." The bobcat, Nova, moved closer, nuzzling against Robert's outstretched hand. Stephen immediately began assessing Robert's condition, while Sarah provided water and radioed in more details about his injuries. Compound fracture of the right tibia, possible concussion, severe dehydration, Stephen reported, but stable for now. "Robert, can you tell us what happened?" Sarah asked gently. Robert took a shaky breath, wincing as he spoke. "I was tracking Nova. She's part of my rehabilitation program, ready for her final wilderness assessment before release." He paused, eyes flickering with pain. "We were doing fine until last night. There was a sudden storm. Lightning struck a tree nearby and Nova bolted, which of course is natural. But the same lightning weakened this tree." He gestured weakly to his pinned leg. "I was following her trail when it fell. I couldn't reach my emergency beacon, so I attached my location marker to Nova's harness. Told her to find help." Sarah and Stephen exchanged astonished looks. "You trained a bobcat to find help?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Robert managed a small laugh, which quickly turned into a grimace. "Not exactly. Nova was found as a very young kitten, raised around humans before I got her. Part of her rehabilitation was learning that roads mean humans. When she's frightened, she still associates roads with safety." He spoke with quiet pride. "I wasn't sure it would work, but I hoped she'd go to the road, and someone would notice her tag." Nova, content to stay by Robert's side, had settled next to him, her spotted body pressed against his, her cautious eyes following every movement around her. "That's incredible," Stephen said, applying a splint to Robert's leg with practiced care. "You essentially improvised an animal search and rescue." "I had faith in her," Robert replied simply. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. The search and rescue team arrived swiftly, equipped with proper medical gear and a stretcher designed for ravine extractions. As they worked to free Robert's leg from beneath the fallen tree, Nova stayed close, watchful but not interfering. Sarah found herself utterly fascinated by the bond between Robert and Nova. It defied everything she thought she knew about wildlife. She had always seen animals as wild creatures, untamed and independent, but this was different. This was something far more profound. As the rescue team prepared to transport Robert, he called out weakly, "Nova, please, someone needs to look after her. She's not ready for full release yet." Stephen stepped forward, his tone reassuring. "I'll take personal responsibility for her until you're back on your feet. Robert, you have my word." A wave of relief washed over Robert's face as he was gently lifted onto the stretcher. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice full of gratitude. "Her carrier and supplies are at my campsite, Fortress Ridge, Site 7734. We'll find it," Stephen assured him with a confident nod. As Robert was carefully carried up the ravine, Nova tried to follow, making small, distressed sounds. Sarah, acting purely on instinct, knelt down to the bobcat's level. "It's okay, girl," she whispered. "He's going to be all right, and you did good, real good." Nova looked at her with intelligent eyes, eyes that seemed to understand more than any wild animal should. There was a quiet recognition there, a silent exchange of trust. The story of Robert Whitley and Nova the Bobcat made local headlines the following day. Man's life saved by Bobcat companion. Interest spread quickly, and soon national news outlets were picking up the heartwarming tale of the animal rehabilitator saved by the very creature he was preparing to return to the wild. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself driving toward the Austin Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, where Robert worked. She couldn't stop thinking about the incredible events she had witnessed, and when her sergeant suggested she do a follow-up for their community outreach program, she eagerly volunteered. The center sat on 20 acres of land just outside Austin. It was a sprawling area of modern buildings surrounded by large, naturalistic enclosures. Sarah was greeted by a young volunteer who led her to a sunlit room where Robert Whitley sat in a wheelchair, his casted leg propped up on a stool. "Officer Winters," Robert smiled, extending his hand. "It's good to finally meet you properly. Last time I was a bit indisposed." Sarah laughed as she shook his hand. "Call me Sarah, please. And you were handling a compound fracture better than most people handle a paper cut." "Adrenaline is a wonderful thing," Robert chuckled. "And knowing Nova succeeded, that was better than any painkiller." "How is she?" Sarah asked, her curiosity piqued. Robert's face lit up with pride. "Why don't you see for yourself? We're about to do her afternoon training session." He wheeled himself out to a large enclosure where Dr. Mitchell was already waiting. Sarah was surprised to see him there. "Steven's been coming down twice a week to help with Nova," Robert explained, noting her surprised look. "Says he's never seen anything like her and wants to document her rehabilitation process for a research paper." Steven greeted them warmly. "Sarah, good to see you again. You're just in time for the show." Inside the enclosure, Nova was exploring. Her movements were graceful and precise, a far cry from the skittish kitten Sarah had first seen weeks ago. She'd grown significantly in the time since, her once small proportions giving way to the more defined musculature of adolescence. "She's getting big," Sarah observed, watching the Bobcat move with fluid confidence. "They grow quickly at this stage," Robert said proudly. "And she's thriving. The experience hasn't seemed to set back her rehabilitation. If anything, it's given us new insights into her cognitive abilities." Steven opened a small gate, allowing them to enter a protected observation area within the enclosure. The moment Nova noticed them, she approached, her eyes locking onto Sarah with focused intent. "She remembers you," Robert said, sounding almost surprised. "Is that unusual?" Sarah asked, slightly taken aback. "Very," Robert replied. "Bobcats generally don't differentiate between humans unless they've had extensive contact. But Nova seems to recognize you specifically." Sarah felt an unexpected sense of connection as the Bobcat regarded her with those golden eyes, as if she were looking into the depths of an old friendship. "What happens to her now?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle but curious. Robert exchanged a look with Steven, and then turned back to her. "That's actually become a complex question. Nova's case has challenged some of our assumptions about rehabilitation. Her ability to navigate between wild instincts and human interaction is unique. The traditional approach would be to minimize human contact and eventually release her back into the wild," Steven added thoughtfully. "But given her demonstrated capabilities, several researchers, including myself, have proposed an alternative," Robert said, wheeling himself closer to the enclosure fence. "We're developing a new program, Wildlife Ambassadors, animals that, for various reasons, occupy a space between wild and domesticated. They can teach us about their species while helping with conservation education." "And Nova would be your first ambassador?" Sarah asked, her tone half curious, half incredulous. "She's a perfect candidate," Robert confirmed. "She has wild instincts, but she's also formed selective bonds with humans. And after her role in the rescue, the public is already invested in her story." They watched as Nova investigated a series of enrichment puzzles placed around the enclosure, demonstrating problem-solving skills that impressed even Sarah's untrained eye. "The rescue wasn't just a lucky coincidence, was it?" Sarah asked, still trying to wrap her mind around everything. "You really did train her." Robert shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Not in the way most people assume. You can't train a bobcat like a dog. What I did was work with her natural instincts and create associations. Roads mean humans, humans mean help when distressed, and the tracking device means me. He paused, the smile fading slightly. I honestly didn't know if it would work. It was a desperate attempt. Well, it saved your life, Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. And changed hers, Robert added quietly, his gaze shifting toward Nova, who was now carefully working through another puzzle. The publicity from the rescue has brought in enough donations to fund our ambassador program for the next 3 years, Robert continued. We're building a special facility where visitors can learn about native Texas wildlife through animals like Nova, who can't be fully released. Speaking of publicity, Stephen interjected, grinning. The governor's office called this morning. They want to present both of you with a special commendation at the State Conservation Gala next month. Robert looked embarrassed at the thought. I told them Nova deserves the award, not me. I believe their exact response was that they don't have a protocol for giving state honors to bobcats. Stephen laughed. But they are using Nova's image on a new wildlife conservation license plate, so there's that. Sarah smiled, recalling the small, desperate bobcat that had once blocked traffic on Highway 83 just a few weeks ago. Who could have imagined that such a creature would save a life and potentially change how people viewed the relationship between humans and wildlife? As if sensing her thoughts, Nova approached the fence where Sarah stood, making a soft chewing sound that seemed almost like a greeting. Would you like to feed her? Robert asked, holding out a pair of long tongs with a piece of meat secured at the end. Sarah hesitated, then accepted the tongs. Under Robert's guidance, she extended the meat through a small feeding port. Nova took it delicately, without any aggression, then sat and calmly ate, watching Sarah with those intelligent eyes. I never thought I'd be this close to a wild bobcat, Sarah admitted, her voice filled with a mix of awe and wonder. She's teaching us that wild isn't as simple a concept as we once thought, Robert said thoughtfully. There's a spectrum of behaviors and adaptations. Nova is helping us understand that the line between wild and tame isn't as clear-cut as we imagined. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the crowd at the grand opening of the Texas Wildlife Ambassador Center. Her department had assigned her as their official representative, but she would have attended anyway. She needed to see how Nova's story had evolved. The center was impressive. Naturalistic habitats designed to give the animals space while still allowing visitors to observe them. Educational displays explained the unique circumstances that had brought each animal to the ambassador program. Injuries that prevented release, imprinting that made wild living impossible, or in Nova's case, exceptional cognitive development that created a unique bridge between wild and human worlds. Nova's habitat was the centerpiece of the facility, a spacious enclosure with rocks, trees, and a small stream designed to mimic her natural environment while allowing her to interact with researchers and participate in educational programs. Robert, now fully recovered, led the ribbon-cutting ceremony, sharing Nova's story with the assembled crowd and media. When he mentioned Sarah's role in the rescue, he insisted she join him at the podium. Officer Winters represented the best of human compassion that day, he told the crowd, his voice filled with respect. She didn't dismiss a mere animal as unimportant. She recognized intelligence and intent, even when it came in an unexpected form. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed to tour the facility, Robert took Sarah to a special observation area where they could see Nova up close. She's become quite the celebrity, Sarah observed, watching the bobcat lounge regally on a rock outcropping, seemingly unbothered by the admiring visitors. Yes, Robert nodded. But more importantly, she's becoming an ambassador for her species. People who see her, who hear her story, they're donating to conservation efforts, supporting habitat preservation. His voice filled with quiet pride. One bobcat has done more for Texas wildlife conservation in 6 months than a decade of traditional campaigns. Sarah watched as Nova stretched and repositioned herself, those intelligent eyes scanning the visitors before settling briefly on Sarah, with what almost seemed like recognition. Do you ever wonder what she's thinking? Sarah asked, her voice almost a whisper, caught in the magic of the moment. Robert smiled softly, a faraway look in his eyes. Every day, but I've learned to respect the mystery. Nova reminds us that animals aren't just simplified versions of humans. They're different, complex in their own ways. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the center, Sarah found herself reflecting on how a routine call about an animal disrupting traffic had cascaded into something that changed so many lives. Robert's, Nova's, her own, and now, potentially, thousands of visitors who would come to learn about the delicate balance between humans and wildlife. You know, she said finally, in 11 years of police work, I've never had a case quite like this one. Robert laughed. I should hope not. Once in a lifetime is enough for me. They watched in comfortable silence, as Nova, the bobcat who had once desperately tried to get human attention on a busy highway, now commanded it effortlessly. Her very presence was a testament to the unexpected ways that humans and animals could impact each other's lives. In the fading light, as visitors reluctantly began to leave, Nova rose from her perch and approached the observation glass where Sarah stood. For a moment, those golden eyes met hers, and Sarah felt again that inexplicable connection. A bridge between two worlds, wild and human, each with lessons to teach the other. It was, Sarah thought, a fitting end to an extraordinary story, and perhaps the beginning of many more.